The Eternal Foundation, the life and legacy of Won-Pil Kim, Reverend Moon's first disciple. Introduction, the pillar of the beginning. In the sprawling, complex history of the unification movement, formerly the Family Federation for World Peace and Unification, FFWPU, centered around the life and ministry of Reverend Sun Myung Moon, many powerful figures emerged. There were charismatic evangelists, brilliant theologians, political liaisons, and industrial titans. Yet, standing apart from all these, bearing the weight not of fame or public notoriety but of absolute, unwavering loyalty and foundational integrity, was Won-Pil Kim, 1928 to 2018. Won-Pil Kim was not merely one of the early followers. He was acknowledged by Reverend Moon himself and by the succeeding generations of the movement as the first disciple. His life, spanning 90 years, served as an irreplaceable living bridge between the chaotic, miraculous beginnings of the movement in post-war Korea and its eventual global institutionalization. Unlike those disciples whose missions sent them outward across continents, Won-Pil Kim's unique purpose was to stand immovable at the very core, the silent, meticulous administrator, the theological anchor, and the embodiment of the purity of the early faith. If Reverend Moon was the architect and the dynamic revolutionary, Won-Pil Kim was the chief structural engineer, ensuring the blueprints were followed with precision and that the foundation stone remained eternally solid, regardless of the storms that raged above. This extensive biography seeks to document the profound impact of Won-Pil Kim's life, detailing his formative years in a Korea scarred by colonialism and war, his pivotal spiritual encounter with Sun Myung Moon, his crucial role, systematizing the divine principle during the Busan Shak era, and his nearly 6 decades of patient, persistent service as the primary stabilizing force within one of the 20th century's most controversial and rapidly expanding religious movements. His story is not just a footnote in the history of the Unification Church. It is, in many respects, the story of its very internal constitution and survival. Won-Pil Kim was born on June 18, 1928, in Pyongyang, during the height of the Japanese colonial period in Korea. This period was marked by profound cultural suppression, economic hardship, and a burgeoning, often clandestine, spiritual fervor among the Korean populace who sought solace and identity beyond the imposed imperial structure. Pyongyang, in particular, was known as the Jerusalem of the East due to its robust Christian evangelical tradition, which created a fertile ground for intense spiritual seeking, even as it was simultaneously a hotbed for anti-colonial political activity, early spiritual environment, and family influence. The family into which Won-Pil Kim was born was deeply committed to faith, though not initially to Christianity in the mainstream Protestant sense. His family, particularly his grandfather, had connections to various Korean syncretic spiritual movements that proliferated during that period, movements often blending Buddhist, Confucian, and traditional Korean shamanistic elements with messianic Christian prophecies. This exposure instilled in young Won-Pil a deep intuitive respect for the spiritual realm and a keen sensitivity to esoteric truth, preparing his mind for the radical theological clarity he would later encounter. However, the most direct spiritual influence came from a distinguished relative, Lee Ki-won, who would play a crucial, albeit complex role in the larger history of the unification movement. Lee Ki-won was a spiritual seeker associated with a Christian group known for their intense prayer and deep study of the Bible, often focused on the themes of the Second Coming and the Last Days. This association brought the Kim family periphery into the orbit of the specific spiritual climate that was actively awaiting a new messianic revelation in Korea. Education and character development. Growing up under Japanese rule, Kim's education emphasized discipline and diligence, qualities that would later define his administrative career. He was known as a quiet, thoughtful, and highly methodical student. The socio-political environment demanded caution, discretion, and a profound sense of responsibility, characteristics that naturally opposed the flamboyant or overtly charismatic styles of many contemporaries. One-Pill Kim cultivated an internal landscape defined by meticulousness and a careful, deliberate approach to truth, a temperament perfectly suited to the role of systematically structuring a revolutionary new theology. The liberation of Korea in 1945, followed rapidly by the division of the peninsula, plunged Pyongyang into the political sphere of the Soviet-backed communist regime. This shift fundamentally altered the religious landscape. Religious leaders and fervent believers, particularly Christians, were systematically targeted by the new administration. This era of intense persecution forced many believers to flee south, but for those who remained, it necessitated an uncompromising dedication to their faith. This pressure cooker environment forged the character of absolute adherence that One-Pill Kim would later demonstrate towards Reverend Moon. By 1947, as the communist grip tightened, many spiritual groups, including some associated with Lee Ki-won, began to move south. One-Pill Kim, then 19 years old, was already deeply searching for a spiritual leader who could provide the ultimate answers to the cosmic questions provoked by the turbulent history of his nation. Part 2. The Elective Choice and the Pyongyang Legacy, 1947 to 1950. The narrative pivotal point in One-Pill Kim's life occurred not in the vibrant South, but during a period of intense spiritual ferment in the fragmented spiritual community of the North, shortly before the outbreak of the Korean War. In the late 1940s, Reverend Sun Myung-moon, then known as Yong Myung-moon, was already active in Pyongyang, having begun his ministry following his deep spiritual experiences in the mid-1940s. Moon's message, a radical reinterpretation of Christian history and prophecy, coupled with a fiercely anti-communist theological stance, attracted severe persecution from the communist authorities. Moon was arrested and imprisoned multiple times. The connection through persecution. While One-Pill Kim himself was spared the initial arrests in Pyongyang, his family network was acutely aware of the spiritual depth of the new leader who was willing to endure such suffering. The reputation of Reverend Moon as a true chosen figure, one who endured imprisonment for his faith rather than compromise, spread among the serious Christian seekers. Though the definitive, formal moment of discipleship occurred later, post-war, in Busan, Kim's spiritual journey during this period involved recognizing the veracity of Moon's claim to revelation. What attracted One-Pill Kim was not merely the promise of salvation, but the structural coherency and profound logical depth of Moon's emerging principle. Kim's methodical mind demanded answers that transcended mere sentimentality, and Moon's teachings provided a framework later codified as the divine principle that integrated global history, philosophy, and theology into a coherent whole. The Search and the Initial Encounter, 1950. The events of the Korean War, 1950 to 1953, forced an exodus of believers south. One-Pill Kim, along with the remnants of the faithful community, made the arduous journey. It was in the chaos and makeshift environment of South Korea, specifically in Daegu and Busan, the temporary centers of refuge, that the disparate followers of Reverend Moon began to coalesce. Reverend Moon, having providentially escaped Hungnam prison during the UN advance, eventually settled in Busan. It was here, in the winter of 1950 to 1951, that One-Pill Kim formally established his relationship with the founder. The spiritual atmosphere of Busan was intense. Refugees, stripped of worldly possessions, sought ultimate spiritual meaning. When Kim finally met Moon, the encounter was marked by immediate, profound recognition. Kim described the moment later in life not as a gradual conversion, but as an instantaneous affirmation of truth, a recognition that the answers he had sought since childhood were manifest in this man. This commitment was absolute. While many early followers came and went, attracted by the powerful message but deterred by the difficult circumstances, Won-Pil Kim devoted himself entirely to serving the founder's physical, administrative, and ultimately, doctrinal needs. Part 3. The Busan Shak Era and the Anchoring of Doctrine 1951 to 1954. The Busan Shak period is arguably the most crucial epoch in the development of the unification movement, and it is intrinsically linked to the service of Won-Pil Kim. This was the time when the movement transitioned from a collection of revealed truths held by the founder into a systematized, teachable doctrine and an organized community. Life in the Tin Shack. After the initial months of refuge, Reverend Moon established a rudimentary headquarters on a hillside overlooking the port of Busan. It was a literal shack constructed of mud, cardboard, and scavenged tin sheets. The conditions were brutally poor, embodying the poverty and desperation of post-war Korea. It was here, in this squalid and humble setting, that the foundation of a global movement was laid. Won-Pil Kim's practical skills became immediately indispensable. He was not a preacher, he was a worker. He assisted in the physical construction of the shack, managed the meager resources, and, most critically, began to serve as the founder's personal secretary and primary confidant. The role of the scribe and the keeper of the word. While the divine principle, the movement's core theology, was revealed and articulated by Reverend Moon, it required systematization and careful preservation. The initial texts were often fragmented, dictated during intense spiritual sessions, and written down by various early followers. Won-Pil Kim's meticulous nature made him the ideal person to handle this crucial task. His role was less about theological interpretation and more about administrative and textual authority. When the definitive lectures were prepared, leading to the eventual written text systematized by Hyo Won-yu, Won-Pil Kim was deeply involved in the process of ensuring accuracy, coherence, and fidelity to the founder's original articulation. He was the guardian of the theological integrity of the emerging doctrine. In the absence of formal organization, Won-Pil Kim managed the early finances, often non-existent, served as the liaison to the few believers who came to hear the message, and ensured the founder was physically sustained so he could continue his spiritual work. He embodied absolute piety, focusing on the founder's comfort and mission achievement above his own needs or aspirations. The definition of first disciple. It was during this period that the relationship between them crystallized into the archetypal master-disciple relationship. Reverend Moon often spoke of Kim as the individual whose absolute faith and enduring patience mirrored the ideal disciple. While others initially possessed greater rhetorical skills or connections, Kim possessed the singular quality of unshakable fidelity, characterized by quiet, tireless service and the complete effacement of his own ego. This loyalty was tested not just by poverty, but by skepticism. The teachings were highly unorthodox, and those who followed Moon were often ostracized or labeled heretics. Won-Pil Kim's commitment provided a stable center in the midst of this persecution. He proved, through silent endurance, that the truth they possessed was worth the ultimate sacrifice. Part 4. Establishing the headquarters and navigating persecution. 1954 to 1960s. As the Korean War concluded and Reconstruction began, the movement needed to move beyond the shack and establish a legal, stable presence, first in Seoul and later internationally. Won-Pil Kim was central to this institutionalization process. The founding of the Holy Spirit Association, HSAUWC. On May 1, 1954, the Holy Spirit Association for the Unification of World Christianity, HSAUWC, was formally founded in Seoul. This formalized the movement and initiated its public ministry. Kim was indispensable in the practical logistics of this founding, securing the first proper headquarters in the Seongsu-dong area of Seoul. The transition from a refugee spiritual community to a structured religious organization required administrative competence, and Kim provided this foundation. He oversaw the registration process, developed internal organizational structures, and established the rudimentary financial accountability required for a legitimate nonprofit organization. The crises of the mid-1950s. The mid to late 1950s were marked by intense, systematic persecution from established Christian denominations who viewed the Unification Church as a cult, and from authorities suspicious of its rapid growth and unconventional lifestyle. In 1955, Reverend Moon was arrested under false pretenses related to military service evasion. This was a critical test for the young movement. With the founder imprisoned, the early disciples faced immense pressure. Pil Kim, along with leaders like Yu Hyo-won, stepped forward to manage the crisis. His role was to maintain internal morale, ensure the continuous teaching of the principle, and manage the administrative affairs necessary for Moon's legal defense. Kim's steadfastness during this period solidified his reputation as the internal anchor. While others might have panicked or defected, he quietly maintained order, demonstrating that the structure of the movement was not solely dependent on the founder's physical presence, but on the disciplined adherence of his core disciples. Marriage and the First Blessing, 1960. The early 1960s marked the transition into the period of family-centric ministry. In April 1960, Reverend Moon married Hak Ja-han, initiating what the movement calls the True Parents Era. Shortly thereafter, the first large-scale blessing ceremony, often referred to as the 36 Couples Blessing, was held in 1961. This event fundamentally shifted the movement's identity from a spiritual association to a family-based faith. Pil Kim received the blessing with his wife, Chung Hwa Lee. His position as the first disciple was symbolically affirmed when he was given the most senior, definitive position within the hierarchy of the blessed families, representing the direct connection to the founder. This cemented his spiritual and familial position as the most trusted elder and representative of the true family, second only to the true parents themselves. Part 5. The Silent Architect and Administrator, 1960s to 1970s. As the movement began its international expansion, first into Japan and the United States, Pil Kim took on the critical mission of building the institutional infrastructure in Korea that would support the global outreach. His genius lay in administration, finance, and the quiet execution of complex, long-term projects. He was the chief operating officer before the movement even understood the concept: organizational structuring and financial stability. Reverend Moon often utilized a dynamic, entrepreneurial approach, launching massive, ambitious projects, educational institutions, factories, media operations, that often stretched financial resources to their limit. Pil Kim was the indispensable figure who brought order to this creative chaos. He was frequently appointed to high-level administrative posts, serving multiple times as the president of the Unification Church in Korea, and taking key roles in the financial and corporate arms of the movement. His work involved systematizing accounting, implementing rigorous accounting and internal control systems crucial for managing the growing influx of donations and income from fledgling businesses, infrastructure development, overseeing the construction and maintenance of major church facilities, ensuring that the physical assets of the movement were legally and ethically managed, personnel management, training the next generation of administrators, instilling in them the principle of self-effacing service and fiscal responsibility. While figures like Colonel Bo Hee-pak handled the high-profile political liaisons on the international stage, Kim was responsible for ensuring the domestic base remained solvent, compliant, and focused on its core mission. He rarely appeared in international media. His importance was measured by the stability he brought to the headquarters, allowing Moon the freedom to travel and expand the spiritual front. the keeper of tradition. As the movement diversified, doctrinal questions inevitably arose, particularly among the new, foreign converts who lacked the cultural context of the original Korean revelation. With the passing of Hyo Won-yu, the principal compiler of the Divine Principle, Won-pil Kim became the authoritative source on the early history and the founder's original intent. He held the profound responsibility of being the living archive, the person who witnessed the revelations, the early struggles, and the definitive articulation of the doctrine. His frequent testimonies and lectures to the core Korean and Japanese leadership served to re-anchor the growing organization to its historical and theological roots, preventing deviation or factionalization based on personal interpretations. The character of humility. Perhaps the most enduring characteristic of Won-pil Kim was his humility. Despite his seniority and critical administrative roles, he never sought personal recognition. He consistently deferred all glory to Reverend Moon. This humility was not merely a personal trait. It was a deeply held theological conviction that the disciple exists solely to serve the mission of the master, and that the foundation must be buried deep and silently support the structure built upon it. Moon often referred to him as his shadow or his son, a reference to the deep spiritual bond in Kim's role as the continuous presence in the founder's life, a witness to both public triumphs and private struggles. Part 6. Supporting Global Expansion and Navigating International Crises, 1970s to 1990s. The 1970s marked the massive global acceleration of the unification movement, centering increasingly on the United States and global political engagement. This shift amplified the importance of a steadfast, reliable center in Korea. The role during the American mission. When Reverend Moon relocated his base of operations to the United States in the early 1970s, he delegated enormous responsibility to his core Korean disciples to manage the home front. Won-pil Kim faced a unique challenge, managing the Korean church while the founder, whose charisma formed the movement's gravitational pull, was physically absent for long periods. His presence ensured continuity of the message and stabilized the finances needed to support the increasingly expensive American outreach, for example, Madison Square Garden rallies, the Washington Monument Campaign. He was the conduit through which the founder communicated his administrative directives back to the Asian base. A significant challenge during this period was the intense scrutiny and public criticism faced by the movement globally, culminating in the legal battle that led to Reverend Moon's imprisonment at Danbury Federal Penitentiary in the early 1980s. During this time, Won-pil Kim served as a spiritual and administrative beacon for the global movement, reassuring members that the core mission remained intact despite the persecution of the leader. His public support was measured, dignified, and rooted in the deep conviction that the suffering was part of the providential course. The corporate arm and economic self-sufficiency. Won-pil Kim was instrumental in developing the economic framework for the movement's self-sufficiency, overseeing key corporate ventures that aimed to support the global ministry without relying solely on donations. He was involved in the development of businesses, such as Ilhwa, a pharmaceutical and ginseng company, Tungil Group, a conglomerate managing various enterprises, and various manufacturing ventures. While not necessarily the external face of the business, his administrative oversight ensured that these entities adhered to the ethical standards and long-term financial goals set by the founder. He understood that organizational stability required economic sustainability, and he managed this complex portfolio with his characteristic prudence. The elder statesman of the blessing. As the blessing movement expanded exponentially, moving from the first 36 couples to 430, 777, 1800, and eventually the mass blessing ceremonies of the 1990s, Won-pil Kim's family took on the symbolic role of the original family, providing a template for the movement's core ideal of the true family. His personal life, marked by consistency and quiet devotion to his wife and children, served as a foundational example of the core teaching of the divine principle, the ideal family. He and his wife often traveled to model the original family ideals for the global membership, particularly in Asian nations. Part 7. The Unchanging Constant in a Changing Landscape, 2000 to 2012. The 21st century brought new challenges to the movement. The natural aging of the first-generation leadership, the struggle to transition authority to the second generation, and the inevitable modernization of doctrine and outreach methods. Through all these transitions, One Pil Kim remained the unchanging constant. Transition and legacy preservation. As leadership roles were increasingly transferred to the children of the founder and other younger dynamic leaders, One Pil Kim's role shifted from active administrator to chief historical consultant and spiritual elder. His primary mission became the preservation of the legacy, ensuring that the historical context and the absolute loyalty of the beginning were internalized by the next cohorts of leaders. He devoted significant time to giving historical testimonies, chronicling the hardships of the Busan era, and clarifying nuanced theological points that had arisen over the decades. His personal accounts are considered invaluable primary sources for historians researching the early unification movement, providing color and detail about the founder's day-to-day life and spiritual work that only he witnessed intimately. The final witness to the founder's ministry. The passing of Reverend Sun Myung-moon in 2012 marked the end of the foundational era for the movement. For One Pil Kim, who had dedicated 60-plus years of his life to serving the founder, this was a moment of profound significance. He retained his position as the most senior disciple and the living symbol of the movement's origins. In the years immediately following the founder's passing, internal struggles regarding succession and doctrinal authority emerged. One Pil Kim's steady presence and commitment to the founder's wife, Hak Ja-han, as the rightful successor, true mother, provided essential stability during a precarious period of transition. His public support reiterated his ultimate mission: absolute loyalty to the established leadership structure ordained by the founder. Part 8. The Final Years and the Legacy of Fidelity, 2012 to 2018. One Pil Kim spent his final years as the revered elder statesman, focusing almost entirely on spiritual guidance and the sharing of his profound historical memory. Role as elder and confidant. He was often sought out by both high-ranking officials and general members for his counsel. His advice was characteristically simple, reflecting his life's philosophy: absolute adherence to the principle, total loyalty to the true parents, and diligent fulfillment of one's responsibility, no matter how small. His life served as a quiet rebuke to ambition and a celebration of self-sacrificial service. His teachings were collected and published in various forms, offering deep insights into the early spiritual foundation of the movement and the specific nature of Reverend Moon's charismatic leadership. These texts emphasize that the core strength of the movement lay not in its external accomplishments but in the internal, spiritual maturity and integrity, the shimjong or heart of its members. One Pil Kim passed into the spiritual world on June 13, 2018, just shy of his 90th birthday. His passing was a moment of deep collective mourning for the unification movement worldwide, marking the conclusion of the generation that had been present during the movement's genesis. His Seonghwa Ascension ceremony was a major institutional event, recognizing him with the highest honors reserved for the most essential foundational figures. The tributes focused universally on his integrity, his humility, and his absolute fidelity, the virtues that defined his unique role. He was memorialized not as a famous executive or preacher, but as the faithful rock upon which Reverend Moon could build his ministry. Conclusion: the archetype of absolute loyalty. The life of One Pil Kim is a profound study in the theology of discipleship. In a religious movement often defined by grand, controversial public actions, massive corporate entities, and global political engagement, Kim's life stands out precisely because of its quiet, consistent interiority. He was the anchor that was never seen above the waterline but prevented the entire structure from drifting in the storms of history. His contribution was threefold: theological integrity. He was the primary witness and administrative custodian of the foundational divine principle, ensuring its systematic preservation and fidelity to the founder's original revelations, particularly during the critical early years in Busan. Organizational stability. He was the administrative genius who created the internal structure, financial, legal, and operational, that allowed a revolutionary spiritual movement to become a sustainable global organization. He handled the often unseen but vital work of governance. The moral template. His unwavering, self-effacing loyalty established the moral and spiritual archetype for discipleship within the movement. He exemplified the principle that true greatness in service lies not in personal ambition but in absolute dedication to the vision of the Master. Reverend Moon often spoke of the importance of the foundation. One Pil Kim was that foundation. He absorbed the shocks, provided the stability, and ensured that the revolutionary house built upon him would stand. His extensive biographical footprint, measured not in the volume of his public speeches but in the enduring structure of the organization he helped build, confirms his unique and irreplaceable title, the Eternal Foundation, the first disciple of Reverend Sun Myung Moon. His legacy continues to inform and challenge successive generations within the FFWPU, reminding them that the strength of faith is found in the quiet, absolute fidelity to the original divine calling.